welcome everybody. My name is Anahid Uğurlayan, and I am co-chair of the Armenian Bar Association's Domestic Violence Committee. We are proud to co-sponsor this series of lectures with the American University of Armenia's Human Rights and Social Justice and Gender Studies minor programs on women and women's rights in Armenia, focusing on the past, present, and future. This program is the future-facing program focusing on advocacy. You can find the pre-recorded past and present lectures featuring Dr. Hazmi Khalapian, Assistant Professor at AUA, and Professor Siranush Sahakyan from the Human Rights and Social Justice Program, also from AUA, on our YouTube page. I'm proud to introduce our moderator and panelists. Dr. Hazmi Khalapian is an assistant professor at the American University of Armenia. Her research focuses on concepts and histories of social change, women's history, Ottoman history, theories of empires and colonialism, gender and international law, and ideologies in the early Soviet period. Additionally, Dr. Khalapian has extensively explored e-learning methodologies, particularly in language and history education. Her work has been featured in international journals and edited volumes, with a forthcoming book on the Armenian women's movement in the Ottoman Empire slated for release later this year. Huri Gedelekyan is a global leader in intersectional feminist network organizing, spearheading collaborative movements to achieve transformational change and gender equality in the UN space. Currently, she is the UN coordinator of Unchained at Last, an ECOSOC accredited organization fighting to stop early marriage in the US, and past chair of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, New York. Born in Beirut, Lebanon, to an Armenian family, Gedelekyan moved to New York City in the late 1970s, starting a business that grew to over 30 team members and 2,000 constituents. The business continues to flourish, although she has transitioned to full-time work in the human rights field. Huri is fluent in Armenian and English, as well as spoken Arabic and French. She survives by meditating and practicing yoga. Same here. Ani Gilosian is a women's rights advocate with a master's degree in global public health from the Icahn School of Public Health at Mount Sinai in New York. Ani works as Director of Development at the Women's Support Center, the premier domestic violence center in Armenia. In her role at the center, Ani has mobilized resources for the center, led gender-based violence programming, and published research studies that examine gender-based violence, women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, and gender politics in Armenia. She is also involved in high-level advocacy and has contributed to shadow and alternative reports. And last, but certainly not least, Mariam Torosyan is an innovation leader and recognized advocate for women's rights, an impact entrepreneur with a multidisciplinary background in human rights law, social anthropology, and public health. She is a European champion of the Cartier Women's Initiative, European Young Innovator WSA, and a Young Transatlantic Innovation Leader. In 2020, she established SafeU with a purpose of combating gender-based violence. This initiative involves a life-saving mobile application and an AI-driven platform. This technological solution has gained recognition as a digital public good due to its capacity to address a critical societal issue. During her journey, she addressed gender-based violence issues and innovations of potential at key UN events, while also engaging in programs like Google for Startups SDG, UNDP Boost for Women Innovators, UNFPA Innovation Challenge, and the UNWTO Awake Challenge. You can submit questions in the Q&A box. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Khalapian.
Thank you, Anahit, for this introduction. I'm honored to serve as the moderator of this panel featuring prominent figures and practitioners in the field of women's rights and advocacy. As Anahit mentioned, today's webinar is part of a series, and I had the privilege of being the inaugural speaker in the very first session. In my presentation, I focused on historical emergence of women's rights with a specific focus on Armenian women in the Ottoman Empire. I discussed women's advocacy efforts across a variety of spheres, including education, access to public sphere, the labor market, and reform in the marriage law. In contrast, Siranush Sahakyan, who was the second speaker, her presentation centered on the current status of women's rights in Armenia. She highlighted the contemporary challenges faced by Armenian women in achieving gender equality. Siranush Sahakyan provided a comprehensive overview of human rights and women's human rights issues. She referenced existing legislation and persisting challenges despite available legal frameworks. So the major question for today's talk, addressing the future, is where do we go from here? Yes, and I want to bring it to your attention that the time span between my discussion covering the mid-19th century and Siranush Sahakyan's discussion covering present-day issues is over 150 years. Yes, for 150 years, we keep going back and forth, and of course, change is in place, but obviously not enough. So this is remarkable to observe that certain arguments and resistance against the advancement of women's rights endure. And this very well echoes with Juliette Michel's famous phrase, women, the longest revolution. Yes, so I will build upon the scenario highlighted by Siranush Sahakyan, where laws exist, but they face resistance and obstacles in their enforcement. And I want to address the panelists, asking them, what are the underlying roots of these resistances? Yes, are they rooted in culture? Are these institutional barriers, or are these systemic biases? And could you share the efforts you're undertaking in your respective roles to combat these resistances? I'm going to ask each one of you to limit your response to 5 minutes, please. And I will start with Ani. And Ani, I'd like to ask you to start by sharing your experience at the Women's Resource Center.
Hello, everyone. Hi, and it's wonderful to be with you today. I will talk about the work that our center is doing, the Women's Support Center. But to back up a little bit and answer your question about resistances, I think we face resistance from a variety of different angles. So when we started this work, and I represent the premier domestic violence center in Armenia, when we started this work to address domestic violence in the country back in 2010, there was really little that had been done up to that point. There was some efforts by civil society, a grassroots movement to really push the agenda forward to bring societal awareness to this heinous crime. But up until that point, there was really not a societal reckoning with the fact that domestic violence even existed. And when civil society actors like us would raise attention about the issue, we would often get a lot of pushback, and people would say, you know, this issue doesn't even exist, or if it does exist, you know, you're kind of overblowing it. It's not as prevalent as you say that it is. But in fact, it is very prevalent. And we know based on the figures that we have that it's roughly 1 in 3 women in Armenia who will experience some form of domestic violence in their lifetime. So, and this rivals figures, right, globally. So Armenia is kind of no exception to the rule. So to your question of resistances, there was a lot of societal resistance to really accepting this issue in the first place. And I think we've made great strides since 2010 when the center first started operating. And at an institutional level, there was also very little that had been done up to that point to really address the issue of domestic violence. There was no domestic violence legislation until 2017. And it took a lot of grassroots movement and a real struggle, and along with top-down pressure from international institutions to really get the ball rolling on that. And I always say that it was a confluence of more than one thing. So without the grassroots pressure, we wouldn't have been able to achieve anything, but also without the top-down pressure, really, we wouldn't probably have passed legislation when we did. So both of those things were really important. So in a nutshell, yes, to your question, there has been a lot of resistances over the years. And I would say that, since our center was founded in 2010, we've made a lot of progress in these key areas. And where our center comes in is, we opened our doors in 2010, firstly, to simply provide women and children with essential services, because up until that point, there was very little being done and nothing really being done in a comprehensive way. So when we first started operating, it was simply offering social services, counseling, and legal aid to survivors. And we soon recognized that this wasn't enough. There really needed to be work done at a societal level to raise awareness about this issue, and also at an institutional level to really push for legislation and push for policies and procedures and practices. So by 2012, we had already we recognized the need also for shelter. We opened our first shelter, but also by 2012, we took advantage of a sort of pivotal moment, which was that we had two very high-profile court cases of domestic violence. And we at our center were really able to leverage the media to cover those high-profile court cases. And up until that point, we were doing campaigning, we were giving interviews, we were talking about the issue. It's one thing to talk about it on public television or to put out advertisements, and it's another to actually get the camera into the courtroom so that people could see how survivors were being treated inside of the courtroom when they were giving their testimonies, the victim blaming that they were often subjected to outside of the courtroom. They were physically assaulted or verbally attacked by ex-partners and family members. Civil society as well were attacked. So people were starting to see this when the media began to cover it more widely. And our center was really also very instrumental in doing that. The other thing that our center did to really push the agenda was in helping to draft legislation. And so our lawyers at our center were very active in this process. And again, this took many, many years of back and forth. Our proposals were rejected several times, but by 2017, as I mentioned, there was enough pressure to have the legislation be adopted, and the state adopted legislation. It was then put into force by 2018. And then following the Velvet Revolution, we saw a lot more advocates taking positions of power and authority, especially at the level of the ministries. And so we were able to collaborate very strongly with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And by 2019, they called on our center to lead a nationwide project to establish domestic violence support centers in every region of the country. And this was a really important moment as well, because up until that point, most domestic violence services were centralized in Yerevan. And now we have a nationwide response to domestic violence, and we also have a unified message. All of our centers come together. We're part of a coalition of domestic violence support centers, and we now have a sort of unified approach. And we've been able also to streamline processes by using the same intake forms, the same database structures, the same referral procedures, and working very closely with state bodies to do so. So in a nutshell, in such a short period of time, we really have been able to make a lot of progress. And it's evident because now we see a lot more of a societal reckoning with the issue. So whereas when we started this work, people typically said, this issue doesn't exist. Now, more or less, people internalize that there is an issue that we have to tackle. And now we have legislation and support also at the state level.
Okay. Thank you very much, Johnny, for this information. And I will turn to Mariam now. Mariam, the analysis of user data from SafeU app can uncover invaluable insights, I into the challenges that women face, especially in concern to their safety. How can we utilize this information to address the persistent challenges that continue to impact women in Armenia, in diaspora, and just globally?
Thank you for your question, Hasmik, and I'm very proud to be here and to be here with Ani and Huri, colleagues that were working on local Armenian and international level. And so about SafeU, I'm now in the United States. I have to say that SafeU is taking this global mission, and we just launched also in European Union and now in United States. But of course, our base stays Armenia. And right from the beginning, when we were designing the app and the technology, because it's not only about the app, but about the AI-based data analytics system, our ultimate goal always remains to be prevention. And for this, of course, we need to rely on how technology can be harnessed to bring evidence-based and data-driven approaches when it comes to mitigating violence against women. And thanks to our data analytics system, which is not using any personally identifiable data. This is something that I always mention, and we are GDPR compliant. So allows us to understand different trends and metrics on how the things are changing, and based on the correlation of demographics and behaviors that we see happening or between like SafeU app and platform, then it gives us understanding of what is the level of trust, level of or gaps in data. And recently we also launched other features of open surveys and quizzes that is kind of closing the gap that we already experienced within the app. For example, one of the findings that I can tell you that within SafeU we see, because there you can choose up to 3 contacts from your personal contacts, your family and friends, up to 3 contacts from existing support services from the network. And you can also activate police, but we see that more than 57% of cases and 57% of cases that are shared, and people are only choosing their personal contacts, which also shows the either level of trust of the knowledge that they have about existing services. And only 18% of users are choosing also services, and only 13% are choosing police. But thanks to our very close collaboration now with Armenian police, we're able to create another like SafeU extension for police to make the consolidation of databases and even response coming from SafeU, and not only again using some data analytics approaches there, which we believe will be another game changer. And this way we will also be able to promote the, let's say, police response within the app. And of course, we continue working with Women's Support Center and all other organizations that are responders of the cases. And we see a lot of also different trends within different geographies in Armenia, because our maps are showing when and where cases are happening. In many cases, we see, for example, that of course they're happening at night times, and the services in that particular regions are not 24/7, which is another big issue. We're also extremely happy to have very close collaboration with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And our end goal is, of course, to serve with these data analytics, which are very advanced. And of course, I can't go in all the details within 5 minutes. But all of this was created to inform policymakers in all the countries where SafeU is active. Unfortunately, because of the issues that Armenia is facing now, the promotion of the app is not an easy task. And we see that we have more users in other countries than in Armenia. But we also, thanks to our partners, thanks to Women's Support Center and other NGOs that are working in the field, we're able to adopt different, let's say, channels for the promotion. And also one interesting thing that thanks to Save You, a lot of people say that the perception of the issue of domestic violence and violence against women changed because this technology and innovation with all the part that it is so cool that we also have AI and stuff that brought another understanding of the issue, especially in the tech ecosystem, startup ecosystem, among developers, among entrepreneurs, and also thanks to the fact that Save You is international, even though it's made in Armenia, but it's international and it is solving the same issue everywhere. The discourse that this is something only local and Armenian kind of disappears. And during our interaction with different groups in Armenia, we see that there is more and more interest and more also collaboration with private sector on how they can engage, how they can participate in advocacy efforts, how they can be channels to inform their own employees. And this is, I think, a beautiful change also in perception and understanding of the issue.
Thank you, Mariam, for the great work that you're doing and for sharing this information with us. I will now move to Huri. Huri, come with the international advocacy background that you come from. Could you enlighten us on the international practices aimed at enforcement and crucial changes in mindsets? Yes, like this culture that we call the mindset. How can we bridge the gap between legislation, its implementation, and the cultural shifts necessary to uphold women's rights globally?
Thank you so much. First of all, I do want to thank the Armenian Bar Association. I'm just so proud to be Armenian right now. I'm sure you all can feel that. And of course, it's interesting that my journey with women's advocacy started at 2010. And Ani, I never made that connection that Women's Resource Center started around the same time. And actually, I started with a change of career, and the first thing I discovered was the Commission on the Status of Women, which is one of the commissions at the United Nations that meets once a year for 2 weeks in March. And that's how I met Mariam and Women's Resource Center. So this is like a full circle moment. And, you know, in so many ways, the global and local are so similar, right? It's always about the taboo. And, you know, we, of course, as Armenians feel like we're the only ones that have shame. Unfortunately, shame does not have any religion, country, sex, but it's also, it's a problem that it is mostly at an individual level. So even though I'm always fighting and working at the international level, one of the things that I have learned and continue to do is always connect the individual with the collective, right? So it goes back and forth between what we can achieve at the United Nations level through the Commission on the Status of Women, which is not a lot, I have to say. I mean, this is, I don't want to sound too negative. I've been doing this for at least 12 years now. And we work so hard. I work with an incredible team at the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. The interest is there globally. Over 8,000 women engage at a personal level, like they'll come to New York or they'll attend events. And when we went virtual during COVID, it quadrupled. In 2011, when we did a virtual forum that is parallel to the Commission on the Status of Women, the 2 weeks my organization, my committee that I was the chair of, puts together a forum. When we went virtual on the platform, 27,000 people engaged in those 2 weeks to learn about women's rights, to bring their expertise, to learn from each other, to share information. And yet, you know, we thought that that was, and especially with during COVID, when we knew it was now so obvious that domestic violence was what was a major issue, now that women were trapped with their boyfriends and husbands and fathers and families and couldn't go to work. You know, we all know this, right? The numbers of violence just grew exponentially. And then, so we've fought it harder than ever. And yes, sometimes there's one step forward, but it always feels like there's 2 or 3 steps backwards. Because at the end of the day, we are dealing, even at the United Nations level, with patriarchy. We're dealing with men who prefer weapons over education and development and equality and all of that. I mean, I don't want to sound too negative. I also feel like this specific conversation today is so important because at that international level, we make sure that it is always connected at the local and regional level. And that is difficult. Who was it? I think somebody said earlier that, you know, so many people don't even know about the United Nations and their rights. And I am so grateful that there are opportunities that we, and this is not just for Armenia, by the way, this is especially in the United States. You know, many Americans don't even know we host these events, and we have a huge influence with the money we donate and the influence that we have with Security Council and all that. On the other hand, though, we really can't give up, and there are some success stories, and I really do think that my 2 colleagues here, Mariam and Ani, and their work that they do, to me, is one of are the success stories, actually. But I have seen, and I'm going to go back to the peace part of it, especially because we all know and we feel it in our essence, right? Our historical trauma and also the current trauma. We really need to address globally and regionally and locally about how peace interrupts all of these processes. You know, it's men who go to war and come back and, you know, can't resolve their trauma. And I think I spoke enough.
Yeah, that's good, Huri, because you get me started on the second question, actually, and you already mentioned pandemic, and we know that in times of this kind of global crisis, we didn't know so much about pandemic because that was new it wasn't in our living memory for many of us. But we know that women and in general vulnerable social groups become more vulnerable in times of crisis. And I want to, my second question pertains to the current turmoil and global political unrest that we're witnessing today with ongoing crises worldwide, such as the war in Artsakh, followed by the blockade and ethnic cleansing of Artsakh Armenians, Russian involvement in Ukraine, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and other instances of global political instability. How do these situations increase women's vulnerabilities? What do your experience tell you about this? What specific impacts do these conflicts have on women, and what additional challenges do they face in such circumstances? And again, I'm going to ask you to please limit be under 5 minutes, and I will start with you, Huri, because you can give us this global perspective, again, international perspective. Could you share with us your insights on international perspectives and provide an update on the status of, for example, UN Resolution 1325, How does this resolution impact the challenges women face globally, and what steps can be taken or are being taken to ensure its effective implementation?
Thank you so much. Well, the good news is that there are resolutions that we can use. There are possibilities, and you know, there are steps that have been taken to bring us forth and also empower us to be able to use. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, in my opinion. It's really heartbreaking to say that, for example, I worked really hard to bring a community together at the global level, at the headquarters of the United Nations. And I'm very grateful to have known incredible organizations like the Women's Resource Center here at the global level, right? And specifically on peace and security. And when this last incident happened with us with Artsakh, obviously it was horrific. I had just stepped down as chair, so I had more time, and I thought, I want to do the best I can to help here. And of course, did outreach to whoever I could. And I'm also talking about not just Armenia, regionally as well. You know, friends we have in Georgia and other areas, youth especially. I want to make sure that I point out the incredible youth in the region that have activated and I've met through the Commission on the Status of Women that I'm so impressed with. It was easier for me to connect on the regional level and learn steps that we could take or there was effort to take than I could achieve on a global level. It was incredibly heartbreaking for me that all the contacts, all the meetings and collaborations that I had done with these global peacekeeping organizations could not lift a finger, could not even respond to my texts and emails. All I wanted to know, because I'm not an expert, right? I'm an advocate and I'm learning as I go here. And that actually is very important to tell your audience too, that we can all learn and do something when, you know, like I'm not an expert. I don't have a degree on any of these things, but I am a grassroots activist that puts my expertise at the global level. I did not receive one answer. And then finally, when it got to be where, you know, Armenians were being kicked out, somebody responded and said, well, maybe we can have a dialogue. I said, dialogue? At this point, you want to, you know, I'm obviously very much interested in dialogue. That's what it's supposed to be. But it's the same situation in Gaza right now, right? So when you're past the point where people are dying and starving, you know, again, I know the only option is to really have an agreement to stop the violence. But where's the rights of people who have lost their rights already? Who have, you know, like we have over 100,000 Armenians right now without their homes. I mean, are we even thinking about? And we, you know, at the global level, there's no opportunities. I mean, I see it. And I have such respect for the Armenian mission. It is one of the smallest missions at the headquarter level, and they work so hard. I know they try hard, and they're limited to how much they can influence. Again, I don't want to sound too negative, but the truth must be said. And at the end of the day, I think it always goes back to the local and the regional level too. So maybe I'll stop here. And then, and by the way, I'm so looking forward to having a dialogue with our audience as well. Please engage and put your ideas and opinions in the Q&A, and we can engage with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Uri. And it's very difficult to be positive when we talk about war, obviously. And Mariam, I will go to you again to ask you for some maybe data analytics. Is this instability reflected in the user information? Can you see that a lot more women are writing, using the app, and just going to you because of this instability? And if you can also give us some global perspective, that would be very helpful, because I'm going to go to Ani to speak more specifically about the women's needs with the war in Artsakh and the ethnic cleansing, obviously. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hasmi. I have to say that SafeU was created during pandemic, during lockdown, is also a response to the situation, and we saw how it started working, especially in Georgia right from the beginning, because the services were inaccessible for people, and thanks to this remote solution, all the counseling and everything continued to be working in the spiritual safe space. So for Artsakh emergency response, we also had other, not online, but also, of course, offline projects that we conducted, because the need was there. And now we continue to provide through SafeU psychological counseling, and we see that it is a very much needed thing. And another factor that we're also conducting research to understand better how SafeU can be serve to the communities from Artsakh. And of course, we know that any conflict exacerbates the situation and results in rise in gender-based violence. We now launched SafeU in Romania as a response to Ukrainian refugee crisis, and used and is already actually used for 5 days now by Ukrainian refugee women who are experiencing a very high risk of also trafficking and gender-based violences. They're here in United States. Why we chose New Mexico as the first state where we're launching, because of a big issue with a Native American population, with a Hispanic and Latino communities, with newcomer communities. So we see how these solutions are needed. Also, the research conducted by UNFPA recently for the Ukrainian crisis, it showed that these women, they tend less to go and apply to services or to call, rather they're searching online, and they feel more comfortable in applying to services and for counseling online, and even for safety, they would prefer something online, which is great fit for SafeU, and that's why and how SafeU was invited to also Romania, Slovakia, Poland, and that's how we're going to continue to expand through Eastern Europe, primarily for Ukrainian women. And in United States, as I said, again, it is mainly used by marginalized groups and those who are just coming to the country. They don't have any papers and anything, and there are like many different ways on how we engage with the network of different organizations that are serving very specific communities, and through SafeU we're establishing this connection between their organization and the community, and then we're bringing these communities closer to also governmental agencies, because there's a big issue of trust everywhere where we are, and kind of we're also trying to close this gap and bridge services to women that are otherwise wouldn't be either accessible or wouldn't be something that they can trust. And of course, as Armenians, our heart is always in Armenia, and for our women from Artsakh, we're continuously engaging in different also community like integration programs that are not specifically done through SafeU. They're all SafeU users. Some of them that didn't even have smartphones were able, thanks to our other partnerships, distribute of smartphones to women from Artsakh, making the service of that we provide also more accessible. This is what we see, and we don't segregate actually data. Is it like women from Artsakh? Of course, they can provide this information by completing their profile, and of course, after ethnic cleansing, we saw when Armenians arrived to Armenia, well, we saw that the increase of user base, and some of them were feeling comfortable to fill in this information that they are from Artsakh. But
Yeah. Thank you, Mariam. This is such a rich information for researchers in the field, actually, what you're saying. And I will go to Ani now. Ani, you already mentioned the Velvet Revolution and how that had an impact in the good sense, yes, on your operation, on the operation of your NGO. Can you discuss the implications of Artsakh War, because then things changed? For a brief period, things seemed to be good, and then things changed with the Artsakh conflict and the war. And I'm going to ask you to discuss the implications of Artsakh war, the loss of Artsakh, and the resulting refugee flow. How have these events created new challenges for women and for you as a director of the NGO, and what measures have been taken to support and empower these women in the aftermath?
Thank you so much for that question. I just wanted to take a step back and again relate what Mariam and also Huri mentioned about what's being done on a local level. In Armenia, we've faced now multiple crises since 2020, and we saw the impacts of the pandemic. During Armenia's lockdown, we saw at our center an uptick in case reporting, and we had about 50% increase in our hotline calls just in that 1 month, which really goes to show, the impact of essentially being locked in one's home with abusive partners and family members, and the sort of need for more resources during that time. And that's why, for a variety of reasons, this was called the hidden pandemic, right? Domestic violence was referred to as the hidden pandemic. And during times of conflict as well, as Mariam already mentioned, gender-based violence, domestic violence is always, conflict always exacerbates the issues that are already pervasive, and this issue specifically. So we see again at our center, and this is also reflected in our numbers, the role that women's organizations play, the role that feminists played during the Artsakh War and in its aftermath shouldn't be underplayed, because it was really exceptional. And I want to really bring attention to that. So even during the first days of the war, women's organizations, feminists, we really rallied together very quickly. Our center, we became a distribution point. So we were gathering materials to send to displaced families, to conflict-affected women and their families, material aid, clothes, household items, and so forth. And then also in the aftermath of the war, we were offering counseling. We were doing awareness-raising sessions. We were going to those collective shelters where women and their families were residing, to tell them about what domestic violence is, because many of them didn't know what they were experiencing was domestic violence. So just enlightening them about what the signs and the warning signs are, and then also where to get help, because these are people coming to their new communities where they're trying to establish a new life. And doing that in times of conflict is already difficult enough. So we were trying to give them the tools that they would need to reach out for help if they needed it. And again, we saw the direct result of that, because within days, we were getting more hotline calls from displaced Artsakhs who needed support. And, we saw an initial kind of surge, but what we saw also was that there was a trickling of cases over time, and this is also to be expected, because right when war happens, right, there's so many issues that women, that families have to take care of, that take precedent. So just putting food on the table, figuring out where you're living, your employment, and all of those things, kind of take precedent in those early days. But we saw that over time, more and more women were coming to us. During the 2023 displacement, we were also very quick to pivot and to provide services to those who needed them. And we took a lot of lessons from the 2020 experience because none of us were prepared for that. And we worked very closely again with state partners, with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and specifically the local municipalities. And what we did, which I think is a best practice that I hope never needs to be replicated, but in the event that we have a future crisis, we know that this works well, is the relationship that we were able to build, our network of women's centers were able to build with the local municipalities was really a good one. And they were there on the ground. They could tell us the needs that women and their families had, and they could also delineate, those who are most vulnerable, most marginalized. And then we were able to work with our sister organizations in the regions to distribute aid, to offer counseling, and we also created safe spaces. Essentially, this means that displaced women were able to come to our centers for therapeutic workshops, for workshops on self-care, and to build a sense of community together. Because a lot of these people, came from various regions of Artsakh in one place. So having the women's center there was really a safe space that offered them not only a way to work through their trauma, but to also build that sense of community, which was so powerful. And this is a program that we continue to do now. So I really just wanted to highlight kind of the role that women's organizations have played in times of conflict and how essential these services are, because we know that during war, during conflict, it's ultimately men and boys who suffer the most in terms of losing their lives. But in the aftermath of war and conflict, it is disproportionately women and girls who are suffering with the consequences of war and picking up the pieces of their family and dealing with acts of gender-based violence.
Yeah, that's so true, Annie. Thank you so much for sharing your insight on that. I will now turn to questions from our virtual audience, and I will read one. I think this is addressed to all of you. Thank you for hosting this important discussion. How do you stay motivated and prevent burnout to continue doing this advocacy work on a global institutional level when there are so many barriers and so much pushback? I've been experiencing this in my university, where the only response to current ongoing genocide and violations of human rights is to engage in neutral dialogue that just further traumatizes students, faculty who are impacted. So whoever volunteers, or maybe if
I'm gonna let Ani and Mariam do, because I already answered. Go ahead, Ani.
Yeah, I can take this question. It's a great question, and thank you for it. I will say as a preface that the real heroes of this work are those on the front lines, our social workers, our psychologists, our lawyers, who are fighting the fight every day. But I'll offer my own perspective as someone helping to lead our center. For me, what helps keep me motivated is kind of seeing things from a broader perspective and seeing the advances that we've made, the huge advances that we've made over the last 15 years. I appreciate, because I was there in the early days when I'd go to the courtrooms and I would see, women assaulted outside of the courtrooms. I was there in the early days kind of witnessing what was happening when there was no legislation, and women and children who were victims of violence were left without any recourse. So fast forwarding to where we are now, in terms of there are mechanisms in place to support victims. Not only that, but the police response has improved dramatically. We are in a situation where, again, we have nationwide coverage. So domestic violence services are available to women in the most rural and remote parts of the country. SafeU is also there to offer a digital alternative as well to support the effort. So we see a lot broader access, which is great. And I also want to say, zooming out even at a regional level, we in Armenia are making a lot of progress. And, there are always threats to a rollback of women's rights, especially when you're dealing with conflict and other issues. But on the whole, we are definitely on a positive trajectory in terms of being able to create a system that is supportive for women and their families. And I look at the broader region and the rollback of women's rights in places like Russia and in Turkey, and now in Georgia, right? There's a threat around the new bill that they're trying to adopt. So there's a lot going on at a regional level, and that also gives me hope to see that Armenia continues on a positive trajectory. I could go into detail about the various gaps in the criminal justice response and all of the work that we still need to do to create a coordinated response. But I do see this progress, and that's what keeps me going.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, if I may, I
Thank you.
completely agree with Ani, and this is also thanks to tremendous work of Women's Support Service Organization, and also I can definitely see that, and institutionally, and our and counseling, everything, we see that we are in positive trajectory for Armenia for sure. And if we compare with other countries in region, we see that we are still keeping this trajectory. Another thing that I can say as someone who believes in the power of innovation and technology. Now, if I just tell you how many countries, how many organizations around the globe just reaching out to us and asking to bring this solution, and we see how women that were so isolated in different countries, by just entering to this space, they talk to other women, not necessarily to this different agencies or organizations, but just to each other, having access to this community support, to peer-to-peer support, is already kind of interesting game changer. And women, by creating and owning our spaces in digital world is also very important, because they're mostly created by men and not designed for women. And I think this is another game changer. Of course, there's a lot of barriers for us, but it keeps us motivating that every day we just wake up and we see the impact that we were able to make, and what people email, text, or put in Save You, and we understand that this is another instrument that can be invested and be there in fight against all these injustices that we face in this world.
That's a very good observation about this world, the technological world, also being dominated not by women, obviously. And thank you, Mariam, for that, and thank you, Ani. Huri, do you want to say anything to that, or should I move on?
Well, I can just add very briefly, actually. First of all, I'm just so grateful to be here, because you all gave me a kick in my, sadness that we're not achieving anything, because Armenia is a very good example right now, despite everything, that we are still chugging along. And also, it's very important to acknowledge that not everyone, like when I talk about, people need to know about the United Nations and the laws and the rules, not everyone has time or the luxury to do all this. But it is important for those of us who do to create opportunities to share the information. The information is important to empower. And that's what I'm so grateful for, like people like Ani and Mariam, who are doing their best to share that information.
Thank you very much, Huri. And it came up, especially I think in your conversation, in your discussion, and in your answer, Mariam, that global and local are linked the entire time, the whole time. And considering the unique challenges faced by women, both in both global and local contexts. How can there be more effective collaboration, or can there be more effective collaboration between local Armenian and diaspora women's rights advocacy groups? What strategies or approaches could bridge the gap and enhance the impact of these collaborations? And I do want to stress that the fact that we're here today is a product of diaspora Armenian collaboration. This is when I was invited to a meeting by Armenian Bar Association at Ani Gilosyan's at Resource Center. So this is how this whole idea of the webinar came up. But can we do better than what we're doing?
You know, do you mind if I just jump in quickly, because I will be quick? I think the most important thing I can add as the global voice is that we have to respect, honor, and listen to the local voice. Global organizations tend to come with the know-it-all, right? We have the, whatever it is, the knowledge, the money, the power. It doesn't matter, because if we are not actually listening, and I'm talking about even in Armenia, not at the national level, and I know Ani and her organization are experts at this, and I'm sure Mariam is as well. If we're not on the ground, the way you succeed is through truly go village to village. And the same at the global level. We've got to acknowledge country by country, and then all the layers below. That's all I have to say on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I can.
Yeah.
I completely agree with Huri, and also thank you for organizing this event. This is clearly, as you said, has made this as what this collaboration on many different levels means. And for us, actually, for SafeU, we always say we are creating. What we create around human. This is a human-centered technology. We learn from them what they need, and we're creating this ecosystem of support where we have local organizations, so like their next village, or the biggest organization in the country, or the representation of international organizations and governments. And that's why when we were developing the dashboard, the platform of SafeU, it's by creating it in a multi-layer way so that it can serve the needs of starting from UNFPA to other international agencies, to government, and then to local organizations. That was our main thing on how we can put all the existing knowledge and support back into her hands, like how we can create something, the ecosystem of support, where we can engage with all stakeholders in many different levels, while sometimes they are not in a big harmony, I have to say, but how we can still bridge this to people that we are trying to serve. And this is the main philosophy behind the code, behind the development of all features and functions, and how we analyze the data. Because in the end of the day, we can't know what are the needs of these people, because these needs are all constantly changing, also because of crisis and this, and then how we understand what people need, and then create this dialogue between different levels of organizations. Because in the end of the day, it's not someone knows something, it's always about humans, about the real life stories, about real life destinies, and that's how we can be there, help, impact in the most positive way possible.
Just like
Thank you very much, Maria.
I just wanted to add very quickly.
Go ahead.
Are you able to hear me? I'm not breaking up. No, I couldn't agree more. And I just wanted to say that really this is a collective effort. Can you hear me? And it's a collective effort because, grassroots organizations like ours, we're embedded in our local communities. So we're we're well positioned to hear the voices of women and amplify them. But without, collaboration to local, regional, right? and international organizations, we wouldn't be able to make the change that we need to make. And this is something I see over and over again in the work that we do. So truly, it is a collective effort.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it definitely is, and this is a witness to that, this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for your insightful conversation and for generously sharing your expertise and experiences in your respective fields. I would also like to thank our audience for their engagement and for following us. Now I'll hand it over to Anahit for closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Halapian, Huri, Ani, and Mariam for this very thought-provoking discussion, which could really go on for an entire day. And I truly hope that we can expand upon this in the future. Thank you also to the Armenian Bar Association and the American University of Armenia for their support of this initiative. To learn more about the Armenian Bar Association's Domestic Violence Committee, you can head over to our webpage, which is on the Armenian Bar Association website. And thank you to all of you for tuning in on a Saturday in the summertime. Enjoy the rest of your day.